My mother and father stole $40,000 from my grandparents for their weddings, but when my grandparents sued them, they were forced to sell their homes, work two jobs, and pay back $48,000 in total. I'm 28 years old. I work in digital marketing in Chicago, and I need to tell this story because what my parents did to me basically destroyed me for years. And only now, after all the legal drama and everything else, am I starting to really process it. The thing is that my parents got divorced when I was 10, and from that moment on, it was like I had stopped existing for them. You know, like I was an uncomfortable reminder of a marriage that both of them wanted to forget. But wait, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning so you understand how we got to this mess. When I was like 8 years old, my parents, Deborah and Raymond, started fighting all the time. And when I say all the time, I mean literally every night. We lived in a small town in Ohio. You know, one of those places where everyone knows each other and gossip flies faster than anything else. And I remember lying in my room listening to them yell downstairs while I tried to cover my ears with my pillow. My father worked at an auto parts factory. He'd been there for like 15 years. And my mother was a waitress at a local diner, the same one where she'd worked since she was 19. And I guess they were both frustrated with their lives and took it out on each other. I don't remember exactly when everything started going to hell, but I do remember the day my father lost his job at the factory. I must have been like 9 years old, and he came home in the middle of the day with this face I'd never seen before, like completely defeated, and my mother started yelling at him before he could even explain what had happened. After that, things got worse, much worse. My father couldn't find work. He spent his time at home watching TV and drinking beer, and my mother worked double shifts at the diner and came home exhausted and furious. I tried to be invisible, you know. I'd go to the library after school. I'd stay at my grandparents' house as much as I could, anything to not be in the middle of their fights. My grandparents, both paternal and maternal, were incredible, honestly. Russell and Alice, my dad's parents, had a small farm on the outskirts of town, and I'd spend time helping my grandfather Russell with the cows and chickens on weekends. My maternal grandparents, Jerome and Irene, lived in town, and my grandfather Jerome had a hardware store that had been his father's. They were the only ones who seemed to really care about me, ask me how school was going, listen when I told them about my friends or my classes. The divorce finally happened when I was 10, and it was horrible, like one of those divorces where both parents use the child as a weapon against each other. My mother told her lawyer that my father was a bum who couldn't keep a job, and my father told his that my mother had cheated on him with someone from the diner, which I don't know if it was true or not. Honestly, the custody battle was shit. Sorry for the language, but there's no other way to describe it. Neither. Odd of them really wanted me, but neither wanted the other to have me either. You know what I mean? In the end, the judge decided on shared custody, 1 week with each one, and I spent my time packing bags every 7 days like I was a refugee or something. What happened after that was that both of them started rebuilding their lives, and I simply didn't fit into those new lives. My mother met Wayne, a guy who worked in construction, like 6 months after the divorce, and suddenly she was all happy and acting like the last 10 years of her life had never happened. My father met Janet, a woman who worked at the post office, and he also started acting different, like more animated, but in a way that felt fake. I was 11, 12 years old at that point, and they were basically pushing me aside. The weeks I spent with my mother, she'd go out with Wayne all the time and leave me with a neighbor or send me to my grandparents' house. With my father, it was the same. He and Janet would go out and I'd stay, alone in the apartment watching TV and eating frozen pizza. The next few years were basically more of the same, only worse. My parents started forgetting to pick me up when it was their week, or they'd show up hours late, and eventually I simply stayed with my grandparents more and more. By the time I was 15, I was basically living with my paternal grandparents on the farm during the school year and with my maternal grandparents in town during the summer. And my parents kind of allowed it without really discussing it or making any formal arrangement. It was like they were relieved not to have to deal with me, you know? And the sad thing is that I was relieved too, honestly, because at least with my grandparents there was stability and someone who really cared about me. When I got to high school, I started excelling academically. Like I wasn't a genius or anything, but I did well. I got good grades. I participated in debate club, stuff like that. My grandparents were super proud, all 4 of them went to all my presentations and school events, and my parents never showed up, not once in 4 years. Not even to my high school graduation. They both had excuses. My mother said she had to work, and my father said Janet was sick or something. But the truth is, they simply didn't care. My grandparents were the ones who cried when I crossed the stage, the ones who gave me gifts afterward, the ones who made a special dinner to celebrate. I applied to Ohio State University in Columbus, like 2 hours from where we lived, and I got accepted to study marketing. My grandparents were so excited, and this is where the story gets really important, although I didn't know it at the time. Turns out that all 4 of them, Russell, Alice, Jerome, and Irene, got together and decided they were going to help me with college. They didn't have tons of money. You know, they weren't rich or anything, but between the 4 of them, they gathered like $40,000 for my education, an amount that, for them, was enormous, like they'd been saving and sold some things and basically made a huge sacrifice for me. But here's the thing, they didn't give me the money directly. They gave it to my parents, half to my mother and half to my father, as a loan that was supposed to be used exclusively by my parents to pay for my college, and then they would reimburse them when I started working. They had this written agreement and everything, signed by both parents, where they promised to use the money only for my college expenses. I left for Ohio State when I was 18, in August 2015, I think, and the day I left my parents showed up to say goodbye, which surprised me honestly because they hadn't been very present in the previous months. My mother gave me a quick hug and told me to call her when I arrived, and my father shook my hand very formally and told me to behave and study hard. There were no tears or anything emotional. It was super mechanical and weird, and I left thinking, well, I guess, this is all I can expect from them. My grandparents did cry, all of them, and they made me promise I would visit them often and tell them everything about college. The first semester at Ohio State was incredible, honestly. I met my roommate Aaron, who became my best friend. I started making friends in my classes, I joined some clubs, and for the first time in years I felt like I was building my own life away from all the family drama. I called my grandparents every week, alternating between the paternal and maternal ones, and they always wanted to know everything, how my classes were going, what I was eating, if I was sleeping enough, all those things. I called my parents less, like once a month if that. And the conversations were always super short and awkward, with them asking me generic things like, how's the weather there, and me giving generic answers, too. In March of my first year, like 7 months after I'd left, I was scrolling Facebook one night after studying, and suddenly see photos from my mother's wedding. And when I say I froze, I'm not exaggerating. I literally sat there on my bed with my phone in my hand, unable to process what I was seeing. My mother had married Wayne. There were photos of them at City Hall. Photos with friends, photos from the small reception they'd had at the diner where she worked, and I hadn't been invited. They hadn't even told me they were getting married. The photos had been uploaded by my mother's friends, and by Wayne. I felt like I'd been kicked in the stomach, you know? Like your mother gets married and doesn't even tell you, doesn't even consider you important enough to send you a text. I called her immediately, and she answered like nothing was wrong. And I said, Mom, I saw on Facebook that you got married. And there was a long silence, and then she said, oh yeah, it was something small. We didn't want to make a big fuss. And I said, but you didn't even tell me. You didn't even invite me. And she got defensive and said, well, Patrick, you've been so busy with college and we didn't want to bother you, plus it was very last minute and you're so far away. I didn't know what to say. Honestly, I was so angry and hurt that I just said okay and hung up. I cried that night. I'll admit it. I cried like I hadn't cried in years. And Aaron found me like that and hugged me and let me get it out without asking questions until I was ready to tell him. 2 weeks later, 2 weeks, I saw on Facebook that my father had also gotten married. To Janet. And again, I hadn't been invited. Hadn't even been told. This was already too much. Like, okay, once might be a mistake or a misunderstanding, but twice, that's deliberate. That's intentional. I called my father, and this time I didn't beat around the bush. I said, Dad, what the hell? You got married and didn't tell me anything? Just like Mom? And he was quiet for a moment and then said, look, Patrick, Janet and I are starting a new life together. And honestly, you're part of my past. You're a reminder of mistakes I made. and we thought it would be better for everyone if we kept this new stage of our lives separate from all that. He told me I was a mistake. Basically, that I was part of his past he wanted to forget. And when I tried to say something else, he just said, "I have to go," and hung up. I was devastated. There's no other word to describe it. My own parents had erased me from their lives. Like literally decided I wasn't part of their new families and wasn't even worth inviting to their weddings. Aaron convinced me to call my grandparents and tell them what had happened. And when I did, all four of them got furious, like I'd never heard them so angry. My grandmother, Alice, was crying on the phone, saying, "How could they do this to you? You're their son." And my grandfather, Russell, was cursing, which was weird because he never cursed. My maternal grandparents had the same reaction. My grandmother, Irene, it was so angry she could barely speak, and my grandfather, Jerome, told me he was going to talk to my mother immediately. What I didn't know, and didn't find out until like 2 months later, was that my parents hadn't used a single cent of the money my grandparents had given them for my college. I had applied for student loans and scholarships and was paying for college myself, living super tight, working part-time at the campus library to be able to pay rent and food. I'd never seen my grandparents' money. My parents had never told me it existed, and it turns out they'd spent it on their own things. My mother used her part for the down payment on a new mobile home with Wayne, and my father used his part to buy a used car and make improvements to his apartment with Janet. I found out about this when my grandparents came to visit me in Columbus in May. All four of them together drove the 2 hours to come see me, which should have given me a clue that something serious was happening. We went to lunch at an Applebee's near campus, and that's when my grandfather, Jerome, pulled out some papers and asked me, "Patrick, is the money we gave you for college lasting you well? Do you need more?" And I was confused and said, "What money? What are you talking about?" And all four of them looked at each other with this look of horror. My grandmother, Alice, explained that all four of them had gathered $40,000, that they'd given it to my parents almost a year ago as a loan to use specifically for my college, that there was a signed agreement and everything. I told them I'd never seen that money, that I was paying for everything with student loans and my library job, and my grandparents went pale. What happened after that was a whirlwind, honestly. My grandparents called my parents immediately, demanding to know what had happened with the money, and both started giving excuses. My mother said she thought the money was for her to compensate for all the years she'd had to raise me, alone after the divorce, and my father said he assumed the money was a gift, not a loan, and that he could use it however he wanted. Both basically admitted they'd spent the money on their own things and had no plans to reimburse it or give it to me. My grandparents told them they had to return it immediately, and my parents said they didn't have the money, that they'd already spent it, and there was no way to recover it. By June of that year, 2016, my four grandparents had gotten a lawyer together and had sued my two parents. The lawsuit was for the full amount of the loan plus interest and damages. Basically, they were asking for like $50,000 total. I felt horrible about this. Like my grandparents had to spend more money on lawyers because of my parents. But they told me not to worry, that this was important, that my parents couldn't get away with this after betraying me like this and betraying them too. The case took like 6 months to really start moving, but when it did, everything fell apart for my parents really fast. My grandparents' lawyer had copies of the signed agreement, where my parents promised to use the money only for my education. He had records of the bank transfers. He had proof that I hadn't received a single cent and was in debt with student loans. It was an open and shut case, basically. What complicated things was that my parents tried to defend themselves, saying the money had been a gift or that they deserved it for other reasons. But they didn't have any documentation to back that up, and the signed agreement clearly said it was a loan for my education specifically. During this time, I tried to confront my parents directly. I went back to Ohio during my fall break, in October, I think, and I went to the diner where my mother worked. She was serving tables when I arrived, and she saw me, and her face changed completely, like she went pale and nervous. And she said, "What are you doing here, Patrick?" And I said, "I need to talk to you about the money my grandparents gave you for me." We sat at a table in the back, and she started giving me the same excuses, that she thought the money was for her, that it had been very hard raising me alone, that she deserved something after everything she'd suffered. And I said, "Mom, that money was for my education. I have $30,000 in student loan debt because you stole the money that was for me." And she got angry and told me I was ungrateful, that after everything she'd done for me, I was siding against her with my grandparents. I told her it wasn't choosing sides, it was about right and wrong, and she told me to leave and not come back. I went to see my father after, at his apartment where he lived with Janet, and the conversation was even worse. Janet opened the door, and when I told her who I was, she called my father and then stood there with her arms crossed while I tried to talk to him. My father looked older than I remembered, like more tired, and he told me I was ruining his life by supporting my grandparents' lawsuit. I said, "Dad, you ruined my life by stealing my college money and erasing me from your life." And he said I was exaggerating. That $20,000, which was his part, it wasn't that much money, and that I could pay it working after I graduated. Janet intervened and said I was selfish for not thinking about how the lawsuit was affecting them, that my father could lose his new job, which he'd gotten like 6 months before, because the stress of the case was making him sick. And I told them that if they'd done the right thing from the beginning, none of this would be happening. My father yelled at me to get out of his house and never call him again, that I'd chosen my grandparents over him, and I left thinking this was probably the last time I'd talk to either of my parents. The case kept moving forward, and in February 2017, there was a preliminary hearing where the judge basically told my parents they were going to lose if this went to trial, that the evidence was clear and they should consider a settlement. By that point, both parents had lost their jobs. My mother, because the diner fired her after word spread in town about the lawsuit and people started avoiding the place when she worked. And my father, because the stress had indeed made him miss so much work that they let him go. Wayne, my mother's husband, divorced her in March, like they'd been married barely a year, because he didn't want to be associated with all the legal drama and because now my mother had no job or money. Janet left my father in April for the same reasons. She moved back in with her parents and filed for divorce. Both of my parents ended up completely alone, without jobs, without partners, facing a lawsuit they were clearly going to lose. In May 2017, they finally reached a settlement out of court. My parents agreed to pay the full amount of the original loan, $40,000, plus $8,000 in interest and legal costs, for a total of $48,000. They didn't have the cash, obviously, so they had to sell things. My mother sold the mobile home she'd bought with half of my grandparents' money, though she lost money on the sale because she'd bought it overvalued, and she had to get a second job at a gas station to be able to pay her part of the settlement. My father sold his car, moved to a cheaper apartment, and also got 2 jobs, one at a warehouse and another at a car wash, to be able to pay. The agreement said they had to pay everything within 18 months maximum, and if they didn't comply, my grandparents could seize what they had left. Part of the settlement also included that my parents had to write formal apology letters, both to my grandparents and to me, admitting what they'd done and accepting responsibility. The letters arrived in June, 2 separate envelopes, and I opened them in my apartment in Columbus, with Aaron sitting next to me, giving me moral support. My mother's letter was short, like half a page, saying, "I'm sorry for taking the money that was for your education. I made a mistake and I'm paying the consequences. I hope someday you can forgive me." It didn't sound very sincere, honestly. It sounded more like something her lawyer had told her to write. My father's letter was similar, maybe a bit longer but equally generic, saying he'd been selfish and regretted hurting me. Neither letter mentioned the weddings they didn't invite me to, or the fact that they'd basically erased me from their lives. They only focused on the money because that's what the settlement required. During all this time, I was still in college, trying to concentrate on my studies while all this family drama was exploding. I graduated in May 2019, 3 years after all this started, with a degree in marketing and a student loan debt that I was eventually able to reduce because my grandparents, after receiving the settlement money, insisted on giving it to me so I could pay my debts. I tried to tell them no, that they'd already done too much for me. But all 4 were inflexible. They said that money had always been for me, and they were going to make sure I received it. With those $48,000, I was able to pay most of my student loans and had enough to move to Chicago and start my digital marketing job. My parents tried to contact me after the settlement was completed, both sending me text messages and leaving me voicemails asking to talk, saying they wanted to fix things. I ignored them for months. Honestly, I didn't know what to say to them or if I wanted to have any relationship with them after everything. It was my grandmother Irene who convinced me to at least give them a chance to talk. She told me I didn't have to forgive them or forget what they did, but that maybe listening to them would give me some closure. So, in September 2019, like 2 years after the settlement, I agreed to meet with them at the same diner where my mother used to work, though she didn't work there anymore. I arrived first and sat at a table waiting for them, feeling super anxious and not knowing what to expect. My mother arrived about 5 minutes later, looking much older than I remembered, with more wrinkles and her hair starting to gray, and she gave me an awkward hug before sitting down. My father arrived 10 minutes late, also looking aged, and sat down without trying to hug me or anything. It was the most uncomfortable meeting of my life. Honestly. Both tried to explain their actions. My mother saying she'd been resentful for years after the divorce and had made bad decisions. My father saying he'd been trying to escape his past and hadn't known how to be a good father. I told them I appreciated that they were finally acknowledging what they'd done, but that didn't erase years of abandonment and betrayal, and that I didn't know if we could have any kind of relationship after all this. My mother cried a little, which made me uncomfortable, because I didn't know if they were genuine tears or if she was trying to manipulate me, and my father just looked defeated, like with his shoulders slumped and his gaze on the table. I told them I needed time to think about everything, that I couldn't just forgive and forget just because they now wanted to make peace, and both said they understood and would wait as long as necessary. We said goodbye without making plans to see each other again, and I left back to Chicago feeling empty more than anything. Like not relieved or angry, just empty. Now, 6 years after all this started, the situation is weird but stable, I guess. I talk to my parents maybe once every 2 or 3 months, short phone conversations where we update each other superficially about our lives but never talk about anything deep. My mother got another job at a different diner in another town and lives alone in a small apartment. She never remarried. My father works at a warehouse still and also lives alone. He didn't remarry either. Neither of them is in my life in a significant way. Like, I don't invite them to important events. I don't visit them at Christmas. We basically maintain a cordial but distant relationship. My grandparents are a completely different story. I visit them in Ohio at least once a month, alternating between Russell and Alice's farm and Jerome and Irene's house in town. They are my real family, the ones who were always there for me, the ones who sacrificed their money and their time and their energy to make sure I had a chance in life. My grandmother Alice is 73 now, and my grandfather Russell is 75, and the farm is a bit harder to maintain, but they still do it with help from some neighbors. My grandmother Irene is 76, and my grandfather Jerome is 78, and he finally sold the hardware store last year, but still helps at the store on weekends because he likes to stay busy. Last week, I was visiting my paternal grandparents at the farm, and my grandfather Russell asked me if I was ever going to really forgive my parents. I told him honestly that I didn't know. That part of me is still so angry and hurt about everything that happened, but another part of me just feels sorry for them. Like they ruined their own lives through selfishness and now they're alone paying the consequences. My grandfather told me I didn't have to decide today or tomorrow. That forgiveness isn't something you give because someone deserves it, but something you give for your own peace of mind. But that I'm also not obligated to forgive if it doesn't feel genuine. And I guess he's right. That eventually I'm going to have to decide what kind of relationship, if any, I want to have with my parents. But for now, I'm okay with this distance, with these occasional calls and this superficial relationship. I feel fortunate to have my grandparents, that they fought for me when no one else did, and that's enough for now.